Okay, so in this video, we will be discussing a few programs on PLSQL, and through these programs, you'll be able to understand how things work as far as writing programs in PLSQL is concerned. So we'll go through 4 questions without wasting any more time. Let's get straight into the action. So the first question that you can see here is this one. So what I would suggest is you pause the video for a moment and go through the question. So I hope you have gone through the question. So what we have been asked to do is, we have been asked to create a table called student. So what I'll do is, I'll not try to explain everything at one go. I'll go step by step. The first thing that I have to do is I have to create this table called student. So let me write down the code for creating the table student, which has 3 attributes, as you can see. The first one being SID, and it is underlined, meaning that it is a primary key. The next attribute is marks, and the third one is grade. So what I would always suggest you to do is, you please write your code in a notepad file and then paste it in your SQL command prompt. That is what I always do. It's the safest option because it's very difficult to edit the code in a prompt such as this one. So what I'll do is I'll first write the code for creating the table student. So let me write the code. So the syntax is, so I'll say create table. Look, I'll just increase the font size so that you can see things better. So let me just increase the font size to 24. Yeah, I think that's better. So I'll say create table, and then I'll give the name of the table. The name of the table is student. So I'll write student, and then I'll list out the attributes, their type and sizes. So the first attribute is SID. So SID is the attribute, and it is of type integer. And we know that the integer has a default size of 32, so we don't need to specify the size in this case. And since SID has been underlined, it is my primary key. Now, the next thing is marks. Next attribute is marks. So I'll write marks as my attribute. And of course, marks will also be an integer attribute whose size is again by default 32 units of space. And the third attribute is grade. Okay, so my third attribute is grade. Now grade will obviously be a character because it will denote a single valued character, either grade A or grade B or grade E or grade O. So to represent such single valued characters, or single character constants rather, to represent such single character constants, we have the data type char, and I'll give it an appropriate size of 2. Okay, so now this is my syntax for creating a table. So what I'll do is I'll simply copy this code. I'll copy the code here and I'll paste it in my prompt, and then I'll hit enter. And as you can see that the table has been successfully created. So that's my first thing to do, that I have to create the table, and I've done that successfully. Now next thing, what I've been asked to do is insert 5 records containing values of SID and marks. One thing you must have noticed is this table student has 3 attributes: SID, marks, and grade. Now we have to insert records containing values for SID and marks. We have to insert values, or we have to insert records where each record will contain values for the attribute SID, student ID, and value for the attribute marks. That means we do not have to enter value for grade. So that is what we have to keep in mind. So let's just insert records. Even for inserting records, what I'll do is I'll write the statements here. So I'll say insert into, and it's a good practice if you're writing your code in the notepad file and then pasting it to the command prompt, it helps. Because if you do that, then what happens is you are able to not only edit your code in a better manner, but also you're able to make necessary changes as and when required, and also keep a copy of those changes. Otherwise, it's very difficult to copy your code from the prompt and then back into a text file. So it's always advisable, as I've been repeating throughout this video so far, that it's Always a good practice to keep your code in the notepad and then paste it to the prompt. So I would say insert into, and then I would give the table name, and then I would mention the list of the attributes for which I want to insert a value. So I want to insert a value for attribute SID. I want to insert a value for the attribute marks. And then I'll write values, and then I'll list out the values in this order. Which is the order that I need to follow? I need to follow the order of SID followed by marks. That means I have to first list out the student ID followed by the student's marks. So let's say I'll give the first student a marks of 80. Okay, like this I'll simply create 4 more records. Yeah, so these are my 5 insert into statements. Obviously I'll change the values. So let's say the student IDs are changed appropriately, and I'll also give different marks. Let's say 70, let's say 67, and let's say 79. So these are my insert into statements. Now what I'll do is I'll simply copy these insert into statements and I'll paste them in my command prompt. And as you can see, I have successfully created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows. Okay, so I'm done with my next task. The first task was to create the table, which I've done successfully. The next task was to insert records. And how many records? 5 records, which I have also managed to carry out successfully. And each record will contain value for student ID and value for marks. Now we have been asked to write the PLSQL code to assign grade to every student based on their marks and according to the following rules. That means I have to write a PLSQL block where I'll be checking the marks. I'll be checking the marks attribute for every record, where every record represents detail of every student. And according to the criteria that has been given here, the criteria you can see here, according to this criteria, I'll assign grades to the corresponding records. That means if I do, let me do a select star for you. So let me do a select star from my table student. Now you can see that there are 5 students whose marks are present, but the grade column is empty. So what I'll do is, what I've been asked to do is I have to write a PLSQL code which will check every mark. So which will assign a grade for every record. So I'll first examine record number 1. I'll check the marks. The marks is 80. Now I'll check in which criteria 80 falls. So I can see that 80 falls in the criteria of E. So what I'll do is I'll assign the grade E to the student whose ID is 1. So E will go here. Then I'll examine the next record. Marks is 90. I'll check the condition. It says that if it's 90 and above, then assign a grade of O. So I'll assign a grade O to the student whose ID is 2. In this way, I'll examine the remaining records and keep assigning grades. Okay, so and I have to write a PLSQL block to do this. And it has been mentioned that I have to update the table student while doing so. Like I mentioned that I'll have to keep on inserting values of grade as and when I examine each record. So if I'm going to insert the value of grade for a particular record, it means I'll be updating the table, right? So let's see how we can do this. So again, I'll move to my notepad and now I'll write the code so which will enable me to assign grade to every student. So let's see how we can do this. So the first thing that I'll do is I'll start with the declare section, of course, which will enable me to keep track of the variables that I want. Now, obviously, I need to run a loop because it's not possible to go through every record one after the other. And in this case, I've been asked to deal with 5 records. What if the number of records increases? What if I have to deal with 50 records or 500 records? So it's always advisable to run a loop, to keep a loop and carry out the checking for every record. So what I'll say is, I'll say number of rows. Now this variable, this will be an integer variable, which will keep track of the number of rows, or which will store the number of rows which are present in my table student. I'll have a variable called stud marks, which will store the student marks for every record. And I'll have a loop control variable called loop var, which will also be of type integer, and I'll give it a value of 1 to start with. So as you know, the assignment operator in PLSQL is of this form. You give a colon followed by an equal to sign. Now next, begin. So in the begin block, what I'll say is, I'll say, now what I need to know how many records are there in my table. See, I have already inserted 5 records. So I know, in this case, I know that I have 5 records in my table. But what if the number of records changes? So it's better to write code which will help me to find the number of records which are present in my table. So how can I find the number of records? If you remember, there is a aggregate function called count star. So if I say, so how many rows are here? 5 rows are here. So if I want this count of 5, I'll say select count star from table. So what is the table? The table is student. So if I say select count star from student, see, I get the row count. I get the number of rows which are present in my table. So count star will enable me to get the number of rows which are present. So with the help of this statement, I will find out the number of rows or number of records in my table. So I'll say select count star. Now, if I'm going to use this statement, if I'm going to use this statement that you see here, select count star from student, if I'm going to use this in a PLSQL block, then I have to store the output. See, I need the output of this command. I need the output of this SQL statement, this 5. I need to store this in a variable. Why? Because that will help me to keep track of the number of times that I need to run the loop. See here, I have to update every record. So if there are 5 records, my loop should run 5 times. If there are 500 records, then my loop should run 500 times. So it's important for me to know how many records are actually present in my table. So I need to store the number of records into a variable, and I'm going to store this in a variable called number of rows. As you can see here, this variable which I'm going to use, number of rows, I'll be storing the number of records present in my table in this variable called number of rows. And how do I do that? Using a PLSQL statements, I'll say select count star into, I'll use this clause, into clause, and I'll specify the name of the variable. I'll specify the name of the variable in which I want to store my value. So I'll say from student. So this will enable me to store the number of records which are present in my student table. Now, after this, what do I need to do? I need to loop through every record. I need to loop through every record. So I'll say while loop var is less than equal to number of rows loop. So this is my while loop, which I'm going to begin. So how many times will this loop iterate? This loop will iterate. How many times? It will iterate the same number of times as I have the number of records. So if I have 5 records in my table, this loop will iterate 5 times. So it will depend on the number of records or number of rows present in my table. Now, for every record, what do I need? I need to check the marks. So in order to get the marks for a particular record, I'll say select marks, and I want to store the marks in a variable because I have to check, right? I have to check the category. So that category checking will be done based on the marks. So I need to store the marks in a variable. So I'll say select marks into stud marks from student where student ID is equal to loop var. Now here, if you notice, what is the initial value of loop var? The initial value of loop var is 1. Now this loop counter variable called loop var, this will contain a value which is same as the student ID. See, I need to identify every row uniquely. That's why I have this condition SID equal to loop var. See, if I don't give this condition, then it will work for all rows, and then I'll get an incorrect result. So I need to give this condition. So since my loop var has the same value as the SID, I can uniquely identify every record using the value of loop var because it represents my student ID. See, because initially what is the value of loop var? 1. What is the SID of the first record? 1. Then my loop var counter, as you will see, it will be incremented by 1. So then it will become 2. Now 2 also happens to be the student ID value for record 2. Then loop var becomes 3. It becomes the same as the student ID for record 3. Then it becomes 4. It becomes the same as the student ID for record 4. In this way, I can see that loop var will have a value which is same as the student ID, and so using the loop var value, I can identify every record uniquely. Now, my job will be to check every category. So if you see the student marks, if it's 90 and above, then it's O. So I'll say if stud marks is greater than equal to 90, then what do I need to do? See, it has been said you need to update the table. So I'll have to write the statement for update. So I'll say, let me just go down a bit. Yeah. So I'll say update. What is the table that I want to update? I want to update the student table. So I'll write student, and I need to set the grade attribute. So I'll say set grade equal to O. And for which row do I want to do this? I want to do this for the first row. I want to do this for the first row. And how can I identify the first row uniquely? I can identify the first row using the SID value. And just like I told you a while ago, that the value of the loop var is same as my SID. So I can say that where SID is equal to loop var. So this will work at a time for one row. Now, once this is done, the next condition is, so I'll say else if. So this is how you write else if in a PL SQL block. So I'll say else if stud marks is greater than or equal to 80 and, sorry about that, and student marks, if it's less than equal to 89, then what do? Then we update. So I'll just copy this statement instead of writing it over and over again. Okay, so just the formatting changed a bit. Yeah, that's better. So I'll say update. Now, if this is the range, if the range is 80 to 89, the grade is E. If you observe, the grade is E. See, this is the grade, E. So I'll say set grade equal to E. And I want to do it only for one record. That's why I'm keeping this condition. Now, next is, now I can just copy this part. I can just copy these two statements. So now the range is 70 to 79. Range is 70 to 79. And then I'll upgrade the grade to A. And then if the range is 60 to 69, if the range is 60 to 69, then I'll upgrade the grade to B. And if you observe, if it's not even 60 to 69, then we'll allot a grade C to all other candidates. So we'll say, okay, so I'll say else, and I'll write this update statement. I'll write the update statement as, set grade equal to C. Okay. Now, after I'm done with all these statements, this if else if statements, then I can close off my if block, and I can finally increment my loop counter variable by 1. and this will bring an end to my loop, and this will bring an end to my PLSQL code. Now, what I want to do is I want to do a little dry run with you, okay? Because I don't think, maybe I've not been able to get the point across where this part, maybe some of you are confused with this condition that I'm writing here. Why am I writing this condition? So let's just see. I think this part is probably understood. Why am I doing this? Because I need to know the total number of records that are present in my table, and this will enable me to run a loop that many number of times. See, I have to update every record. So since I have to update every record, I need to ensure that my loop runs that many number of times. So my loop should run n number of times, where n represents the number of records in my table. That's why I'm doing this, to get the number of records. Now loop var is my loop control variable. So this will start from 1 and it will go up to the count of the number of rows. Now see, initially the value of loop var, as you can see here, I've initialized it to 1. So initially it's 1, and the example that I'm doing here, I've inserted 5 records. So number of rows is 5. So obviously initially, since loop var is 1 and number of rows is 5, this condition is satisfied. And I'll get inside, and what will I do? I'll say select marks. Okay. So I'll select which attribute? I'll select this attribute, this marks attribute that you can see here, the one which I'm hovering over with my cursor. So I'll select this marks attribute. That's fine. From which table, and what will I do? I'll select the marks attribute and I'll place it inside this variable stud marks. This variable which I've declared here, stud marks, I'll place the marks value inside this variable stud marks. And from which table? From the student table. Now, if I keep the statement up to this point, if I don't have this condition, then what will happen? Then it will try to take all these marks values. It will try to take all these marks values and try to place it inside my variable stud marks. But as you know, a variable can hold only one value at a time. So then I'll get an error. Now what I'm doing is I'm putting this condition. What is this condition? Where SID equal to loop var. What is the value of loop var initially? Initially it's 1. So where SID equal to loop var means, now you check, you'll take only that row where the value of SID is same as the value of loop var. So what is the current value of SID? I'm examining this row. The current value of SID is 1. And what is the value of loop var? The value of loop var is 1. So it will only update this record, the first record. It will only try to update this record. So the marks of this record, which is 80, is now stored in my variable called marks. Stored in the variable called marks. Now I'm checking. In fact, it's stored in the variable called stud marks. Sorry about that. Marks is the attribute name of the table, and stud marks is the variable which I have created to store the marks of a particular record. Now, what is the value of stud marks now for the first record? For the first record, it's 80. So obviously this condition is not satisfied because 80 is not greater than or equal to 90. So you come to the else if part. Is 80 greater than or equal to 80? See, 80 is equal to 80, so this part is satisfied. And is 80 less than or equal to 89? Yes, even this part is satisfied. So you come to this update statement. So what do? You update the table. Which table? You update the table student. And while updating, what do? You set the grade attribute. You set the grade attribute to E. And you do it for which row? You do it for the row where SID is equal to loop var. So what is the SID? So the SID is 1 and my loop var is also 1. So there is a match. So loop var is currently 1. So it matches loop var, since it's currently 1, it matches with the first row because the first row has an SID of 1. So what will happen? The grade attribute for the first row will be updated correctly to E. And since this is an if-else block, if one part is executed, the other statements will be ignored. And you will come out of the if block and you will simply increment your loop variable by 1. So if you increment your loop variable by 1, then loop var changes from 1 to 2. And then you do the same thing like I explained for the second row, the row which has an SID of 2. And then you do it for the third row, fourth row, fifth row. And ultimately, when loop var becomes 6, this condition that you see here, the while condition, this is violated. And since this is violated, you will come out of the loop. And finally, your PLSQL program will come to an end. So let me run this program for you and show you the results. So you can see, so what I'll do is I'll just clear the screen for you. Let me show you the output. So this is the output that you see. So this is before I have run my PLSQL block. Now let me run this PLSQL block for you. So I'll start from the declare part and I'll go up to the end section. Simply paste it over here, write a /. And as you can see, it's saying that PLSQL procedure is successfully completed. Now, what I'll do is I'll show you the contents of the table. So I'll select star from student table. I'll select star from the, that's the name of my table, student, as you can see, student table. So I'll say select star from student. And now you can see that the grades have been appropriately updated. See, before this PLSQL block was executed, the grade column was empty. Now, after executing the PLSQL block, the grade columns have been appropriately filled up. You can see that if marks is 80, then the grade is E, like it should be. See, if it's between 80 to 89, the grade was E, and that is what you see here. If it's 90 or above, it's O. If it's 70, it's A, 67B. So it worked, right? So I hope you've understood this part. Now, what I'll do is I'll try to go over another program, that is this one, the second program, and I'll do that in the next video. Okay, I'll see you in the next one then. If you have any doubts, of course, you please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Thank you.